Good afternoon. I'm Elizabeth Davis, Executive Vice President and Provost at Baylor, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the fifth in a series of symposia to celebrate the inaugural year of our President, Kenneth Winston Starr, the one who's still walking around the room. I should have waited, and I'm sorry. Earlier this academic year, our President called us into a period of strategic planning, a time of contemplating how to carry out our grand tradition, pro ecclesia, pro texana, for the church, for the world. Everyone in this room is encouraged, if not expected, to be a part of the strategic planning process. And we want you to be engaged in an informed way. We all bring important, distinctive perspectives to the table, but there is much to learn from each other and from experts in various fields. In fact, the speakers for the Presidential Symposium series were chosen for their expertise in areas that can directly inform our thinking about the future of Baylor University. Speakers who will challenge us to think broadly and creatively about higher education and the world in which we live. Of course, we have other opportunities for hearing from authorities who can inform our deliberations. For example, last night, our President invited T. Boone Pickens to be our first guest for On Topic, a new program that will feature a series of conversations between our President and experts on issues vital to all of us. When today's speaker learned that he was following our first On Topic event, he suggested that perhaps his presentation would be off topic. Now, if the conversation we had at lunch today is any indication, he might be right. We discussed everything from trombones to jazz bands to jails and cabaret dancers. It was a delightful time, and I know we're in for a treat this afternoon. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to ask Dr. John Englehart, Dean of the School of Education, to introduce our speaker to you.
It's great to follow somebody tall enough that the mic is already adjusted up. There are a few phrases associated with Baylor that are used more often than faith and learning. Yet I can think of no phrase that seems to lack consensus on meaning more than this one. Some interpret these as no more than a simple profession of the mutual but separate importance of faith and of learning to an education from Baylor, while others look to bring meaning to the intersection of these two terms. And in no area of Baylor's programming are perspectives on faith and learning more relevant and challenging than in its curricula and in the implementation of curricula. So what does it mean to be liberally educated in an institution like Baylor? And what are the challenges and opportunities for a university that concomitantly values academics and a pervasive religious commitment? No one is better positioned to help us address such questions of teaching and learning than Lee Shulman. Holding 3 degrees, a bachelor's degree in philosophy and a master's and doctoral degrees in educational psychology from the University of Chicago, Lee is part philosopher and part psychologist, drawn to issues and challenges of teaching and learning at all educational levels. His early work at Michigan State most notably addressed the mutual importance and meshing of subject content and how people learn into powerful subject-specific pedagogies, which he calls pedagogical content knowledge. This groundbreaking work addressed a variety of fundamental questions and concerns about the nature and development of subject-specific pedagogies in teaching. It has been cited over 5,000 times in education literature and has profoundly impacted the vocabulary and content of educator preparation in the United States. And in 1997, after moving from Michigan State to Stanford, he was chosen to be the 8th president of the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, where he established major initiatives addressing doctoral education, as well as how a variety of professions prepare those who would enter the professions. After 10 years, he retired from Carnegie in 2008. Dr. Shulman is a fellow both of the American Academy for Arts and Sciences and the American Association for the Advancement of Science. He is the recipient of numerous awards and honors, including 15 honorary doctorates. I could continue in this vein, but I think you probably get the picture of a powerful and thoughtful academic who has devoted his life to the improvement of education at all levels. On a personal note, I have known Lee and his wife Judy for over 25 years and have yet to have a discussion with them that was not stimulating, if not profoundly so. Lee has a wonderful sense of humor and is the only person I know who, when delivering his final address at a major professional association about his life's work, had the humility to use the occasion to reflect on his own mistakes and missteps so that others might learn from them. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Lee Shulman to the podium. His presentation is entitled, Learning to Profess, Challenges and Opportunities for Liberal Education in a Faith-Based University. Dr. Shulman.
Thank you very much, John, Elizabeth, President Starr. A word about that title, Challenges and Opportunities. One of the lovely things about becoming president of the Carnegie Foundation was the illustrious character of my predecessors. My immediate predecessor, the late Ernest Boyer, was a frequent visitor, I think, to Baylor, and someone both whose life and whose work sat very beautifully at the nexus of matters of faith and of scholarship. But the phrase that resonates with me is that of the fifth president of the Carnegie Foundation, a gentleman by the name of John Gardner. I think someone that most of you will recognize from his many years both of Carnegie leadership, but also serving as Lyndon Johnson's Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare after the Kennedy assassination. He often referred to him as LBJ's token Republican cabinet member. His first meeting with the staff at HEW, he opened by saying to the staff, "We are confronted with an array of unlimited opportunities that are masquerading as insoluble problems." And it's no secret that many of my colleagues in the world of higher education would often view the notion of juxtaposing liberal education and a faith-based university as a contradiction in terms, as mutually incompatible values. What I want to do today is spend some time this afternoon talking to you about a conception of both liberal education and the Baylor-like context, from which I conclude that not only is the juxtaposition of liberal education and faith-based learning not a contradiction in terms, that properly understood and addressed, exploiting the possibilities instead of hiding from the difficulties, there is no better setting for a deeply liberal education than in a seriously faith-based university that simultaneously identifies itself as both a research university and as a home, a habitat, if you will, for liberal learning. So that's where we're going to end up. Anybody who doesn't want to take the journey in the middle has, as the provost probably never said when she was teaching accounting, that's the bottom line. So let me begin by three stories that may seem disconnected at first, but as if there's anybody here from the seminary, the secret of homiletic is how to take three verses that sound like they're totally disconnected and have them all end up in the same place. Are we any professors of homiletic? Ah, wonderful. Okay. Wonderful. I never got that far in a seminary, but homiletics I knew was always my favorite topic. Story number one. I had just been appointed president of the foundation, and I was returning by plane from Jerusalem, where I spend a fair amount of time as an advisor, a consultant, a teacher, and have for many years. And I was heading from Jerusalem to Messiah College in Grantham, Pennsylvania, where my predecessor, Ernest Boyer, had been a graduate. He graduated from Messiah and had been on their board for many, many years. I gave a talk when I arrived that had the delicious title, From Jerusalem to Messiah. I've never had a chance to give that talk again, but it's... And as it turned out, there was a great delay in the transportation, and I didn't get to Philadelphia, where I was being picked up, until 3 o'clock in the morning, and I proceeded to explain to my friends at Messiah that what seems to be delaying the return is at the Atlanta airport somewhere. I mean, there's a... In any event, I get picked up by car by a young man who is a graduate of Messiah, and he's going to drive me the 3 hours across the state to Grantham so that I could speak the next morning somehow. And we begin a conversation. I mean, I wanted to sleep, but somehow it didn't seem fair to the young fellow. And so I asked a little bit about him, and it turns out he had graduated the year before. He had married a young woman who was finishing her senior year. He was working in the admissions office. The admissions office apparently is a great spot to select drivers for difficult times of day or night. And I asked, well, what was your major? He said it was religion and theology. And I was expecting he was going to probably pursue the ministry in one of the kind of broadly Anabaptist denominations associated with Messiah. And I said, so what are your plans? He said, well, I've been admitted to graduate study at the Yale Divinity School. And my silence at that point must have been eloquent. 4 o'clock in the morning, and I guess I was quiet, because he said, you seem surprised by that. And I said, well, yeah, I mean, I'd never been to Messiah College. I didn't really know about their curriculum particularly, but like so many people in higher education, I had a stereotype. And I said to him, aren't you likely to find the manner in which the study of sacred texts at Yale is going to be very different than what you did at Messiah? And he said to me, and I've never forgotten this conversation, I mean, 14 years ago almost. He said, I guess you really don't understand education at Messiah College. He said, most of us come from homes where we were very seriously engaged in religious practice, read the Bible a lot, but when we came to college, we only had one way of reading the Bible. We could only read it devotionally. What we've learned at Messiah is that one can read this rich text both devotionally and critically without losing your capacity to read it either way. Well, that wasn't the response I had expected. And I subsequently, during subsequent visits to Messiah, sat in on classes in Bible. Hebrew Bible happens to be one of the things I love the most, and I spent time studying Hebrew Bible, and I found the classes fascinating, but they reflected precisely that kind of melding of the devotional and the analytic that I had rarely seen in other settings. That was the first story. The first story. The second story. We built a new building when we moved the Carnegie Foundation at the age of 90-something from its longtime home on the East Coast. It had been at Princeton under Ernest Boyer's leadership, to the west where it surely belonged. And we built a home for the foundation, what I called a habitat for thought, on a hillside next to the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences overlooking Stanford and San Francisco Bay, and I felt the building needed a proper dedication. So I invited two friends, a minister and a rabbi, to help lead the dedication ceremony. And they asked me if I had a favorite, either biblical or other kind of aphorism that I thought would be appropriate to what it is that we were intending to do in this setting. The Carnegie Foundation is a center for educational thinking and policy work and research. And the verse that I asked them to build into the ceremony is the following verse. It's a verse that is said every Sabbath in the Jewish prayer book, and it's a quotation from the Talmud. And it goes like this. Rabbi Elazar said in the name of Rabbi Hanina, sages, scholars, increase peace in the world. Scholars increase peace in the world. And it goes on with a set of interpretive elaborations. And one of the rabbis early in the 20th century wrote a commentary on this verse, and he said, well, there you have great proof that the rabbis of the Talmud had a sense of humor. Because who would ever associate peace and quiet and the absence of conflict with scholars? What do they do for a living? You get two scholars in a room, you get three opinions, you get 4 position papers, you get 5 political parties. I mean, the essence of scholarship is that scholars are always engaged, and the Hebrew word is a wonderful word, in machloket, in dividing up and taking different sides of things. And then Rabbi Cook goes on and says, but that is a misunderstanding of the relationship between argument and peace. He said, because true peace only occurs if you create settings where you multiply the alternative, conflicting, contradictory views, opinions, and observations so they can be in combat with one another. Because when there is machloket, when there is a division of opinion, and here the Hebrew word is fascinating because the root of that Hebrew word is the word for a piece of something, chelek. The notion is that in an argument, every position is but a piece of a larger whole. And if you shut down any of those views, you preclude the possibility of reaching shalom, which in this case doesn't just mean peace, but means completion. It means fullness. It means comprehensiveness. And Cook goes on at the end of his commentary to say, we must value and nurture and invite a competition of views, because ultimately all these competing views are the words of a living God. That's the second story. And I just felt we put together a staff at Carnegie of people vociferously disagreed with one another about important matters. I don't know if it was quite the extent of Mr. Lincoln's cabinet, but we tried. And out of that came ideas, publications, and studies that I don't think we possibly could have even imagined without that kind of a diversity of opinion. So that's the second story. The third is not really a story, but in many ways it sets the challenge that higher education confronts today, and especially higher education in an institution like ours. Many of you are probably familiar with the recent book by Robert Putnam, American Grace, following by more than a decade his writing of Bowling Alone, I kept on thinking badminton or something, Bowling Alone. He wrote this really remarkable to me study of religion in America. But I would just like to highlight one aspect of his findings. And it was that no country in the world has a population as seriously religious as the United States. We are the most religiously committed population in the world. I'm not sure where he gets this number, but I'm struck by, he said, we are more religious than the Iranians. And we think of that as a kind of religious state. But unlike most countries in the world, we are also religiously diverse. Deeply committed religious people, diverse across religious traditions and commitments. And the third characteristic is that we are also religiously tolerant. That there is no country in the world where you get religion taken so seriously, across so much diversity, and we don't go around killing each other about it. I mean, just read the newspapers every day. And the question, one of the questions that Putnam, as a political scientist and a social philosopher, I suppose, is asking is, how is that possible? What accounts for this miracle? And I have an intuition that I'm going to be trying out on you today. And part of that intuition is that one of the reasons it works is because we are a society, going back to our founding and the Federalist Papers, if you will, not only tolerates differences of opinion, nurtures, protects, and encourages them. That we see it in some ways as the lifeblood of what it means to be civically engaged in this democracy. That this celebration, if you will, of machloket, of understanding that even when we disagree most vehemently, the likelihood is that all of the sides have some piece of insight that will be valuable to everyone, is at the root of what makes American democracy unique and special. And that the American version of liberal education is extraordinarily compatible with that perspective. So, those are the three verses. Let me now try to do what, at the Carnegie Foundation, one of the studies we did was a 4-year study of the education of clergy. And one of our advisors said the essence of becoming a member of the clergy is the development of pastoral imagination. And he defined pastoral imagination as somehow being able to start with the texts of the sacred readings on the one hand that are fixed and with us as our starting point, and the incredible kaleidoscope of problems, personal, social, political, in the world, and finding ways, in a meaningful way, to create homiletic bridges between them. So, let's try. What I'd like to do is to talk about a conception of liberal education. It's not the only one. There are few ideas in our world about which there's more machloket than what counts as liberal education. So I'll provide you with the definitive one, of course. Then I'm going to describe a piece of empirical psychological research that explored in depth how that plays out in a particular setting, and then explore with you what the implications of those ideas are for the practicalities of teaching and learning in the liberal arts in a faith-based university. So let me start with giving you some sense of the perspective that I bring. In my own background, I am a lapsed yeshiva student. For 6 important years of my life, I devoted about 4 hours a day, 5 or 6 days a week, to the study of Talmud and Torah. I did not continue on to seminary training. I shifted to a different kind of seminary, a once Baptist university called the University of Chicago, which I realized after a few months was very much like the yeshiva, except with different texts. But many of the same characteristics of learning carried over. Much in the same way that I had studied rabbinical or other sacred texts, reading every word carefully and trying to make sure that no nuance was lost. And why was this extra word there and not there? We would read Aristotle or Galileo or Plato or Augustine or Machiavelli or Dewey in the same fashion. Those transferred. We didn't have any lectures. You would not have been subjected to this in the old days on the Midway. In 4 years, all of my courses were in groups of no more than 20 or 25 students. The assumption was you'd read the original source material, you sat around the table, and you argued. You argued. You think it means that? I'll tell you what it means. 3 weeks on one act of The Tempest. Took me years to be able to watch that play with any joy. I do now. You can go too far. You can go too far. And so I think one of the things I bring is a perspective of having really inhabited what on the surface look like 2 utterly different educational environments. That as the longer I live, the more I see the compatibility between those settings. Not the congruence, they aren't identical, nor would you want or expect them to be, but a kind of synergistic compatibility that is part of my sense of optimism and hope about the ultimate generative compatibility of education in a religious institution and liberal education, because one could not imagine 2 institutions more devoted to their particular missions than those 2 were. So, what's liberal education? Funny you should ask. My colleagues at Carnegie did a fair amount of work on how people became professionals. We studied education in the law. Our book, Educating Lawyers, I think has had some impact. I think it called for so much radical reform, President Starr, that you decided to leave legal education and do something easier. We also did similar studies of educating physicians, nurses, the study of educating clergy in the Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish worlds, educating engineers. But in a lot of that work, we also asked about this peculiar American obsession that by and large you can't study to be one of those professionals without getting a modicum of liberal education first. They don't do that in Europe. Now with the Bologna process going on there, they may begin doing an imitation of us. But typically in other parts of the world, you go directly into the study of engineering, or of law, or of medicine, or for that matter of psychology or chemistry, without interrupting that with things like philosophy or general humanities or social science, or in the case of the humanities, studying science or mathematics. So we have this, and so it's a legitimate question to ask, why do we do this? Why would you want people who are either going to become professionals, or going to become business people, or going to become responsible parents, community leaders, whatever, political leaders, to have a liberal education? And the last big study my colleagues, William Sullivan, Tom Ehrlich, and Ann Colby did in this area was to take the largest undergraduate major in American higher education today, which is business. If you take all of the kinds of business degrees one can get as an undergraduate, that's the largest nationally. And to ask, what is the role of liberal education in preparing people at the undergraduate level for business? And in order to do that work, my colleagues came up with 3 dimensions of liberal learning, of liberal education. And I'd like to lay them out for you because they're going to be an important piece of my argument. The first dimension is that a liberal education teaches students analytic reasoning, to think analytically, critically, to read carefully, to interpret in a grounded manner, whether what they're addressing is a poem by Emily Dickinson, or a story problem in algebra, or the text is a painting, or a prayer, or a play, or a chemical formula. That one of the major foci of any liberal education is to teach people to slow down, to look carefully, analytically, critically, and ask, what does this say? What does it mean? This is non-trivial. This is non-trivial. When we were doing our study of educating lawyers, and I asked one of my colleagues who taught contracts, what's the biggest problem you have in teaching law students? And he said, they've never learned to read. They've learned to skim and to talk generally about what it is they've read. But they've not learned to read. Now, one of my premises is that at faith-based institutions, because we treat, and our students treat, certain kinds of text as sacred, as having a certain inherent importance, richness, worthwhileness, we learn, or ought to be learning, to read with a kind of care, a kind of reverence, which in this case I mean to be both devotional and analytic, that may not be ubiquitous in American higher education. Moreover, sacred texts are particularly difficult to read. Why? Because relatively speaking, I can't think of many other texts other than perhaps the United States Constitution where so few words are asked to do so much, and to do so much not only for the era in which they were written, but for generation after generation after generation. Therefore, these are texts that were either written with or every generation has imbued with so many layers of meaning and nuance that in order to read them both devotionally and analytically, you simply have to slow down and savor them. in ways that in some ways are unnatural. One of my former students who did the research that I'm going to refer to in a moment, his name is Sam Weinberg, is at Stanford the Margaret Jacks Professor of Education and History, and he wrote a prize-winning book called Historical Thinking and Other Unnatural Acts. Well, to the extent that what historians do is read source materials very carefully. Show me a historian and a piece of source material, and I'll show you somebody who looks at it and then turns it over to say who wrote it, when, and why. I mean, very careful reading. And this is an unnatural act. And to the extent that reading and observing and thinking analytically and carefully this way is the first principle of liberal learning, I would argue that those of us in faith-based institutions start this race with an advantage, because it is part of the set of traditions, dispositions, commitments that we bring to the table to begin with. So that's the first one, analytic reasoning. The second one is the one where the critics of faith-based education are most quick to critique us. Sullivan, Colby, and Ehrlich argue that the second most important principle of liberal learning is that you not only learn to reason analytically, critically, deeply, but you learn to address the same problem, the same text, the same topic from multiple perspectives. That a liberally educated person is someone capable of taking different points of view about the same topic, not being locked into any one. That doesn't mean that she has to be equally committed to each point of view. Commitment is another piece of the whole. But they have to be fully capable of seeing the degree to which it is reasonable and even persuasive to view problems from perspectives quite different from their own. And that requires analytic reasoning as a prerequisite, but analytic reasoning alone is not enough. And so the question of, now I hope you can see why I talked about machloket, about the pieces being prerequisite to the whole. I also must say that in the Jewish tradition from which I come, the notion really is a frustrating one when you take the pieces to put them together in the whole, because at least as I understand the Jewish tradition, every generation continues to try to make it whole, and each generation ultimately will fail and leave the rest of the task to the next. I particularly love the Midrash about Moses bringing the 10 Commandments down from Sinai. And you'll recall that after 40 days of bed and breakfast on Sinai, Moses comes down with these rather heavy tablets that God himself has carved, and the finger of God has written the Torah on these tablets. And what does he confront? He confronts a frat party with a golden calf, and he throws the tablets down and breaks them. And the usual interpretation is people didn't deserve it, so much for this great gift I'm bringing them. But the Midrash that I particularly love says, no, that isn't what happened at all. That when he saw what was happening, he realized that he and God had collaborated on a terrible mistake. Because what they were bringing down was the whole thing. All of the law, all of the Torah, leaving nothing for the people to do. And when you do that, you can't expect others to make something their own. And so if you read the biblical story, Moses goes back up another 40 days, but this time Moses carves the tablet. God dictates and Moses writes. Very different product. And what he brings down to the people successfully this time is incomplete. And he presents it to the people, and he says, and you won't find this in the biblical text, this is in the Midrashic elaboration, here is the incomplete Torah. We have begun it, but you, through your studies, through your actions, through your aspirations, through your dreams, through your commentaries, you must complete the task in each generation. These are the pieces. And it's one of these, the nightmare jigsaw puzzle where you realize 3/4 of the way through that you may have lost some of the pieces and it will never be done. Well, this is the jigsaw puzzle of this tradition. And so the notion that you have to be able to come to this from different sides, from different perspectives, and recognize that you'll never have it totally right is a tradition which I think is both religious and liberal, which invites and obligates multiplicity of perspective, of view. You never know when the most way out view will turn out to move the argument a giant step forward. Just look in a field like medicine, how many theories were seen as absolutely nutty 20 years ago and are now the basis for entirely new and quite hopeful approaches to therapy and to human growth. So that's the second, multiple perspectives. The third perspective, and this is the one that I think most liberal education institutions that are secular tend to lose sight of regularly, is that even if you've successfully taught students to be analytic and deep and interpretive, and even if you have succeeded in helping them learn to take multiple perspectives on complex problems, the third aspect of liberal education and liberal learning is that students find personal meaning in what it is they've learned. That they don't stand outside looking in, but that this is a process of formation, a process of developing an identity, a sense of membership in a community, where not only are the things you've learned valuable, they're indispensable. You can't do without them. You've got to look analytically. You've got to be sensitive to nuance. You've got to teach yourself to see the world from many angles, because that becomes the kind of person, the kind of human being you are. That kind of richness, that kind of generosity of spirit, that kind of path to meaning. Most universities are very uncomfortable with personal meaning, with, vocation. You don't hear that word very much. And so the intellectual is kept at a very distant level. It's the disengaged scholar that is given the highest level of respect. And I think what my colleagues are saying here is that a liberal education provides people with a set of tools that are powerful intellectual tools, that are powerful tools for being a productive member of a diverse civil society. But ultimately, the job of liberal education is incomplete if it doesn't reach into the personal identity, the formation of the learner in the institution. So Why do I think that at a faith-based institution we actually have a better chance of achieving this kind of liberal education? Because not only are the dispositions to treat sacred text with a certain kind of analytic reverence and devotion and care already part of the picture, but so is the search for personal meaning. So is the notion that we are here not only for instruction but for formation. And if this formation can be somehow arrived at through the often trying crucible of looking at multiple perspectives and alternative views and competing, conflicting machloket, then perhaps all the more resilient and rich will that formation yield. Well, all this is kind of nice stuff to talk about in general. But what does it look like concretely? So I'll tell you about a study. Professor Sam Weinberg and his colleague, Dr. Ellie Gottlieb. Weinberg, as I said, professor at Stanford. Ellie Gottlieb lives and works in Jerusalem as director of the Mandel Institute. Also a psychologist. Wanted to study how do historians who are centrally in the guild of historians, they're academic historians, but are also religious believers, serious members of a faith community, how do they read sacred texts that are filled with accounts that are very difficult to justify using historical evidence-making? What do they do? Okay, you are a faithful Christian, an observant Jew. You are a professional historian, and now you're reading in detail the account of the Exodus from Egypt. How do you handle that? Now, they used a method called the think aloud method. It's a method that we in psychology use a lot, where you give somebody a problem and you ask them as they're doing the problem, think out loud while you're doing it, so we can get a sense of what you're thinking about, what you're considering. I spent 10 years studying physicians that way. Hearing what physicians are thinking while they're examining you is a frightening thing to do. I don't advise it, frankly. They weren't my physicians, and they were working with actors and actresses that we trained, so nobody was traumatized. But anyway, it's a very useful way to do things, and we actually have a number of historians around the country who we've taught how to do this kind of work so they can study how their students do historical thinking and other unnatural acts, but mainly historical thinking. And so Sam and Ellie gave different texts for these folks to read. And let me read you, a couple of those texts so you'll see what they were being asked, if you will, to make sense of. Well, I won't have to read it. You're all sufficiently familiar with biblical texts. Remember the text in Exodus of the first Passover and the Exodus from Egypt, the splitting of the Red Sea, the number of people going across, etc. By the way, and then they also would read another text in which archaeologists are critiquing the Exodus account on the grounds that there is no archaeological proof whatsoever that any of this occurred. So, what sense do you make? I mean, here's a kind of classic multiple perspective problem. What do you do with it? And the people were thinking aloud. So let me read you some of their thinking alouds as they were reading some of this stuff. And let me begin with Professor B. Professor B, let's assume for a moment that he is a professor of history here at Baylor. Professor B was a historian at a faith-based university, and he's reading the Exodus document. I'm quoting him now. As a historian and a Christian, I'm very interested at the interface of belief and scholarship. So ultimately, I would play with something like this reflectively. I would entertain the possibility of a history at one at the same time governed both by human choice and divine will. Because I'm a historian, because I'm a practicing Christian, I'm forced to ask these questions of each of these dimensions of my life. The fact is, the flip side of that is to ask to what extent faith is rooted in that which can be demonstrated according to canons of historical evidence, and to what extent does that faith require at the human level an exploration into the genuine, the documentable, the authenticatable historical narrative. So as a historian, Professor B gave priority to claims based on verifiable evidence, but he simultaneously embraced the possibility that an oral tradition, such as the one in Exodus, might be valid in the absence of corroborating evidence. He goes on. The ways in which the faithful assume, on the one hand, that which is described in Scripture is equivalent to historical narrative seems simplistic. But equally simplistic to me are interpretive stances by scholars that assume if no record exists, save this initially oral tradition, then clearly we have a case of a tradition that is mythical in the sense of being fictional. You know, that raises my dander. I prefer, as they say, a hermeneutic of reserved judgment rather than a hermeneutic of suspicion. All this is a spontaneous think aloud. The hermeneutic of... Notice something now. What you're hearing from Professor B is not only that he is trying to take analytic techniques and strategies from the two parts of his life, but he's saying, look, ultimately they both live here, and I can't throw out one of them or the other. I've got to figure out how to coordinate these perspectives. All of that, he continues, is part of me as a historian and a believer. They're not contradictory. They're not compartmentalized. They are supplemental in a sometimes mysterious way. I can't not be a historian when I think of matters of faith and the narratives of the tradition. But then I can't not be a Christian when I do historical scholarship. Now notice he doesn't have a pat solution. But notice, I guess for me as a psychologist, the richness and the nuance of his thinking. The complexity at which he's trying to make sense of it, not as if he were solving a Sudoku puzzle or something, but it's personal. He's saying, I'm a historian, I'm a Christian, and I have to make sense of these things. Now, that's one way of trying to do it. Another one of their participants was an Orthodox Jew teaching history at a public university. They gave him the same documents to read, and they asked him, which of these documents best supports your views? One of the documents was by somebody who said, any Jew who doesn't believe in the accuracy of the Exodus story ought to stop being a hypocrite and stop observing Passover. Well, that was sort of an extreme point of view. And so they said, no, which of these views fits with you? And his answer was, on what day of the week? When I'm teaching my class or when I'm in the synagogue. His response, Weinberg says, brought into focus the choice of guilds before him. Should he affiliate at that moment with the Guild of Professional Historians that he joins every Monday morning at the university? Or should he identify with the co-religionists with whom he worships on Saturday morning at the synagogue? When I'm teaching courses, he said, I'm bound by the rules of historical research. And I have an obligation to explain to my students what the tradition of historical scholarship has to say about this material. Now, when I'm in the synagogue, I'm not going to be talking about the historical evidence of the Exodus. I'll be contemporizing, metaphorizing, allegorizing, because essentially my task there is to make the traditional come alive. And to do that, the historical veracity of the business is hardly relevant at all. And at some point later on, he laughs about the problem of interpretation. And he says, you know, really, people don't live or die as historians. They live and die as people. But again, they're struggling in different ways. The Christian historian is trying to get them to coexist at the same moment and place and time. This particular Jewish historian says, look, these are equally valid for me, but they work in different contexts for me. I'm not proposing which of them is a better solution. I have no idea. What strikes me is the seriousness with which they address the problem. I read this study, and by the way, the study is coming out, for those of you who follow such things, in the Journal of the Learning Sciences, not in a journal of religious practices. This is a major journal of cognitive psychology, and I think it's the first time they have published a study that deals with this kind of topic. In effect, what they are dealing with is the connection between personal epistemology, the way we make sense of what counts as knowledge in the world, and personal identity and religious identity and community membership. This is a topic so important for us in settings like this. How many of us who teach history, humanities, have sat down and tried to answer the question, what sense are our students making of the choices we place before them? Over the course of their 4 years at Baylor, do we find that the kind of thinking they do when confronted with these kinds of challenges moves from being monolithic to being more complex? Do they consider more alternatives? Do they at the same time handle these complexities without falling apart? Have they given the tools to achieve personal meaning and yet not flee from the complexities and the richness of a world we've introduced them to? This study, I recommend to all of you. I hope that they write a more, a less technical version of the study, because it's utterly fascinating in the way in which it presents these problems and these challenges. So, where does that now leave me in this situation? One of the places it leaves me is to say, it's one thing to understand that the problem exists. The question is, what do we do about it? That ultimately the challenge of a university is pedagogical. It's one thing to say, this is our mission, and I've read your mission statements. I've read lots of mission statements over the past decade. The question that's often begged is the curricular and pedagogical one. Okay, that's where you want to go. How do you get there through teaching and learning? What do you and the students do together in the time you've got in each other's presence? And of course, you're in each other's presence now 24/7, given the net. I used to laugh that in the old days, I would lecture and my students would sleep. Now when we teach over the net, I can sleep while my students are up, awake, and having to listen. It's finally payback, faculty. They're at 3 o'clock. What are your students doing at 3 o'clock in the morning? They're writing that paper or they're reading something on the web. What I'd like to draw examples from is the work we did on learning to profess. My colleagues and I, as I said, studied how people learn professions. And we asked, how does somebody learn to do something as complex as medicine or nursing, as law or engineering, and of course, the challenges of the clergy, which are really quite endless. And one of the metaphors that dominates my thinking as I think about this is one that applies to medicine and nursing, and it's the pedagogy of rounds and rotations. If you're in nursing or in medicine, or if you watch any of the myriad television shows about those professions, you know. Anybody here watch House? You don't? You're watching American Idol? When physicians, both early in their careers and later, and same with nurses, are learning to do clinical work, the teaching is at the bedside. They go in small groups, multi-generational. So you might have the senior professor, then you'll have more junior physicians, all the way down to maybe third-year medical clerks, interns, residents. And the fascinating thing is they do the same thing every day. That's why they call them rounds. They go round and round. It's like an orbit. And yet every day is different because the data change, the patients change. A patient who seems stable suddenly becomes unstable. A patient who looks like she was at death's door is up and singing songs. New patients come in, new things occur. And so at the one level, rounds are the same thing over and over and over again. At another level, what fills the rounds changes dramatically. Look at the first year of law school. You go from class to class, not only within the same law school, but across law school. And the equivalent of rounds there is the kind of case dialogue pedagogy that goes on in class after class after class. There are rules of engagement. Some of them cruel, but not here. In which, I don't think, well, who knows? Yeah, they're probably cruel. The point is that what we have in a pedagogy that is teaching people to profess is a combination of routine and novelty. Routine in that the pedagogy in many ways is the same day after day after day, but it's unlimited in its challenge because the content of the rounds changes. And we talk about rounds and rotations because in medicine, your first rotation might be internal medicine. Then you go to pediatrics, and the rounds are the same, but the content is different, the patients are different, the diseases are different, the challenges are different. So this combination of novelty and routine is terribly important to teach people to profess, by which I mean developing the habits of mind, the habits of skilled practice, and especially the habits of the heart that are what we mean when we say that somebody has learned a profession. And in this sense, professions of understanding and professions of faith are both part of that discipline. Now, what you see in these forms of pedagogy also is that students are highly visible. Even a law school class with 100 students sitting in a contracts course, you ask one of those students whether they're relaxed, and they'll say, no, Mr. Starr might call on me today, and I'll never know when. It's the cold call. You've always got to be ready. The assumption is you've read the case and thought about it. If there are 6 of you rounding together in medicine, well, you know that every day you're going to be visible, accountable, and performing your understanding. This kind of visibility, this kind of accountability, this kind of performative expectation, this anxiety, you have something at stake, leads to the development in a deep sense of a capacity for professing in each of these fields. My colleague Ann Colby summarizes that kind of pedagogy with 3 words. She says, a pedagogy of professing is characterized by enactment. You don't just sit there passively, you got to do something. Embodiment. The teacher and fellow students actually embody, model the values, the dispositions, the states of mind, the habits of the heart, the orientations that you're trying to teach. It's not something out there. The teacher is part of the pedagogy. And the third, after enactment and embodiment, Anne offers, is dailiness. Dailiness. You don't develop the kind of habits of mind, heart, and hand that are part of what it means to be formed, if you will, by doing something once. You know, yes, we give a course in business ethics ain't the answer. Same thing in law, same thing in the doctor-patient relationship. Yeah, we do that on Thursday evenings, third year of medical school. There is a sense of dailiness that combines with the enactment. What all that means, and I felt it at the University of Chicago, I must say, 50 years ago, was there is a self-conscious intentionality shared by the members of the faculty and the students. The faculty all understood that every day was an opportunity for students to argue about something and gain new insights, to develop more and more personal autonomy with regard to matters of thought, and that they, the faculty, had to discipline themselves to try whenever they could never to say, God, that's stupid, but rather, well, why would you say that? What's your reasoning? What's the evidence? What makes you feel so strongly about that? And to do it again and again and again, whether you were reading, Brown versus Board of Education or Machiavelli, where you're reading Galileo's dialogues on motion, or you were reading The Tempest. So this kind of intentionality runs so contrary to some of the misunderstandings of academic freedom that I feel we intellectuals and faculty have adopted. Intellectual freedom, academic freedom, I don't think means that we can all do whatever we feel like if we share a common mission. There are still plenty of degrees of academic freedom available. As we say, certain things are routine and repeated. The content is typically not. People think what was important about the University of Chicago was the great books we read. It was nonsense. We could have been reading a totally different set of books. We could have been reading all the books of the Bible. It was the pedagogy that made Chicago different. It was the kind of discourse of learning and teaching, of argument and of openness that made that education a liberal education. It isn't the canon of work, it's the kind of work that was canonized. That's what counted. Moreover, I'm as big a fan of the prophet Isaiah as any of you are, but there's an aspect of Isaiah that is simply either wrong or incomplete when you think about liberal education. Because if you take those three principles I mentioned seriously, and the most difficult of all, the multiple perspective one, then our job as liberal educators is not to make the rough places smooth. It's to make the smooth places rough. We don't want the hills and the valleys to become plains. We not only want students to engage with the rough places, a liberally educated student seeks out those challenges because they recognize, as you would see from looking at the think-alouds of those two historians, they were learning, they were getting deeper even as they were wrestling with these texts. And if all you look for are smooth places, you're not going to get that kind of exercise at all. So Alfred North Whitehead had this lovely phrase, seek simplicity and distrust it. And I think that's the principle here. If you look at the development of knowledge over time, there are phases of simplification and complexification, and they just go on this way. But since our students so often are looking for something simple, something to cut the complexity down, our job is to make those smooth places rough. Well, what's the job then of the university? And with this I will conclude. What I've laid out somewhat incompletely, I think, is a challenge to you at Baylor. Now, it's a challenge to every university, but you made the mistake of asking me to speak here. And it's a challenge that no government or state of Texas is going to hold us accountable for. You know, governmental accountability programs are usually pitched much lower than that. This is our aspiration. And although I can talk about what the pedagogy looks like, the fact is we don't know. We certainly don't know enough. And so if you take seriously this image, this vision of a nexus of liberal education, faith-based education, analytic reasoning, multiple perspectives, and personal meaning, if this is a vision that even comes close to what you take seriously, then you also have to acknowledge that there is a great deal we still don't understand about how to do it. We don't understand the extent to which it can only succeed if the students are totally allies with us in the effort. This is not something we can do to students. It can only be something we do with students. In that sense, it's more like psychotherapy than it is like vaccination. And when you want to do this with students, it's asking them to make major changes, and we should not be surprised if they push back. Because, as in psychotherapy, when you ask people to change in some personal, deep sense, they're entitled to push back. Who were you to tell me to do this? I was a perfectly happy kid growing up in Beaumont, and now you're asking me to do this. I don't need that kind of complexity in my life. Well, yes, you do. Because if this democracy is going to succeed, it needs people of faith like you who are also people who develop what? Weinberg and Gottlieb have this lovely phrase to describe what the two kinds of folks I read about to you did. He said they had developed the capacity for epistemic switching. They were able to switch from one sense of what counts as knowledge to another, and to do it with a kind of fluidity and a kind of skill and comfort. Comfort even with the discomfort. Epistemic switching. Well, when I'm in the synagogue, I can think of it this way, or the Christian scholar saying, I'm doing them both simultaneously, and they each enrich and complicate the other. But they're doing both. And I would say, that's not good enough for me. In a democracy, which depends on citizens who, like the scholars, through their arguments, enrich peace in our country, we need epistemic empathy. We need to be welcoming and sensitive to, more than tolerant, to those views that are different from our own. And I would even borrow a concept I learned from the Dalai Lama, epistemic mindfulness, where we don't simply wait for somebody else's view and then say, oh yeah, that's okay too. But we are actively seeking, looking for other views that can enrich our own, even though we haven't thought of them. If we see that sort of epistemic mindfulness as a major goal of liberal education in a democratic society, it's got to be approached both with intentionality and with self-doubt. Self-doubt in the sense that the first ways we think about doing it are probably going to turn out to be wrong. And we won't know unless we actually subject our own work to the same sort of critical analysis. That University of Chicago that I went to was not only founded as a Baptist institution, its first president was a Bible scholar named William Rainey Harper. He taught at Ohio Baptist Seminary. His specialty was Hebrew. One thing that William Rainey Harper and I have in common is both of us supported ourselves by teaching Hebrew while we were adolescents. I did much better than him. I met my wife that way. He died at the age of 49, just after completing his commentary on the book of Joel. Presidents had lots of work to do in those days, Mr. Starr. You know, Hosea is still waiting for a commentary. And one of his eulogizers said that his principle of the research university, this is 1906, was that a research university is a place where everything should be subject to investigation and inquiry. But any place that arrogates itself the privilege of saying we are free to study anything had better recognize that it better start with itself. That a university, research university, properly understood, must see itself as an ongoing experiment. And a true experiment is not one where you run the experiment and never look at the findings. It's one in which you take the experiments you're doing seriously and you constantly ask yourself, how do I know it's working? What unintended consequences are there? Are we developing a program to open up our students and it's turning out, not that we tried to make them more dogmatic? Could that happen? Anything can happen. We have research done by Nobel laureates teaching science. Carl Wyman at Colorado was an example, taught this great course on science for non-scientists. And then they did an evaluation of the course afterwards and learned that at the end of the course, students knew more about science than they did before. But they hated science more. Well, he'd lost sight of that. I'm asking you, if you're going to take the work you do seriously, and I don't see that you have an alternative, that you take it so seriously that from the president and provost down to the first-year assistant professor, part of your expectation is, what are you doing not only to make this the finest teaching university that you can, but what are you doing to constantly study the extent to which your dream is not a hallucination and just wish fulfillment? That's serious work. It's serious enough that people who do it ought to get tenure and salary raises for it. They ought to be valued within the institution and the community as people who are helping make the institution run. So I'll end with a story about my favorite rabbi. You all know him, Rabbi Hillel. He was such an important rabbi that all of the Jewish student centers around the country are called Hillel houses. He lived at the time of Herod the Great, as did some other great figures in religious history. And one of the stories that is told about Hillel is that a skeptic came to him and said to this sage, "Tell me everything of importance there is in your Holy Bible in the time that I can remain standing on just one foot." And I don't think this was a guy noteworthy for his sense of balance. And Hillel smiled and said, "Do not do to another what you would not have him do to you." That's the essence, said Hillel. That's the essence. But it's only the principle. What really counts is the commentary. Now go out and learn. And so I say to you, I think as I read the mission statements and as I talk to some of you on the faculty, that there is a kind of shared view of the essence, a kind of joint commitment to the principle, the aphorism. But it's all in the commentary. It's all in the enactment, the embodiment, and the dailiness. And that we're not going to figure out unless we do it and learn from what we do. So like Hillel, I say to you, you do understand the essence. Now, go out and learn. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Now, as he said, he gave us the pieces, not all the parts. We have work to do, but I bet you have some questions that you'd like to ask before we go out and try to get all of this solved. So we have mics coming down the sides. So who would like to ask the first question?
Now, let's get a little Mount Wilkett going here.
Got a shy audience. This can be like law school. I'm not a lawyer, but I do know names. I can do cold calls. Yeah, that could be scary. Okay.
Break the ice. Thank you. Oh, sorry. Thank you. Thanks, Teresa. The role of the faculty, these three great dimensions of a liberal education, thinking analytically and so forth. But the third, you said, tended to be, I'm paraphrasing, neglected in many universities, this sense of calling, vocation, as we would say in the Christian tradition. Commentary on the faculty in this dimension of the liberal education.
I think that we and I speak as somebody who spent 35 years as a faculty member, I think we often have great reluctance to intrude, quote unquote, on the personal space of our students. Just to give you an example contrary to that, I was very struck by some classes I observed in some of the seminaries where, after studying a passage of sacred text, the instructor for the last 10 minutes of class turned to the students and said, "All right, what does this mean to you? How does it touch part of your sense of who you are or would want to be?" I mean, sometimes they would say, "How would you preach on that?" Which was perhaps a safer way of asking the same question. At Messiah College, at the end of a class on biology, I remember the instructors saying to these undergraduate students, and they were studying some aspect of evolutionary theory or something, it was sort of straight biology, and it was a she stepped back and said, "What is it that we've learned today that will affect how you will lead your life on Monday?" And, when I first heard it, I shivered because it just didn't feel like the right thing to say. And then I realized she, as a faculty member, was taking up that challenge in a small way, in a gentle way. But the overall message was, if this doesn't carry any personal meaning for you, and if you're not working on having this be personal for you, then we're all failing in some sense. So, I think if we come at it backward in some ways, and don't start with analytic reasoning, start with what kind of human being is it whose formation we are interested in here at Baylor. And I'd like to believe that it isn't one model of a human being, that there are different kinds of human beings who may share an underlying belief system, but they aren't going to look like clones. Then beginning to unpack that and say, if that person is going to live a productive, generative life in their religious community, in their social and political community, and as a citizen in this democracy, what sorts of things do they have to be able to know and be able to do and be disposed to do that we can help them develop here at the university and begin mapping backward? And I think, the sorts of things that we do best at a university are the intellectual, are those that involve the life of the mind. We're not going to be able to do everything. This isn't basic training. And maybe that's a better way of getting at the personal meaning thing than starting, as I did, the way most of us professors do, with the analytic reasoning and working down. So in the law, if you and your colleagues in those days had started with, if our goal is the formation of a lawyer who is always consciously and intentionally wrestling with the dilemma in the law of being both a zealous advocate and an officer of the court, I mean, the kind of the standard, do they understand what that means? Do you understand the extent to which that's not a set of skills out there, but something that's got to inhabit their gut because they should be wrestling with this if they're doing serious work? And then unpacking that into, well, then how do we teach the first year so that isn't something that, as in too many law schools, waits until the third year of law school after you've got the technical skills. You've learned to think like a lawyer. Oh, yes, let's think about the officer of the court role. And so maybe that's the way to approach it. But that's the best I can do right now. Yeah. Microphone?
I'm thinking about your second principle of liberal learning and as I understand it, the ability to look at a problem or an issue from a multiple number of perspectives. And you, as I understood you to say, made a distinction between the ability to imagine what that would be like and actually be committed to a particular perspective. It sounded as though your new friend from Messiah College had moved from perhaps in his earlier years the idea of being committed to a single perspective to being able to adopt a number of perspectives. And I think that for a lot of our students, that's the direction of motion also, that they move from maybe a narrow perspective to seeing a variety of perspectives. It seems that there's a possible danger there in the students losing the vision for being able to remain committed, to a perspective where, well, everything's equally true or accurate or relevant. Can and should, or how can or how should, I don't know, I'll be lost here in a minute, an institution such as ours help students to do both of those?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly the right question. And I could cop out easily but honestly and say, talk to John about that. That's an empirical question. I mean, the fact is that there is no simple, I don't think you were looking for a simple, kind of well-understood solution. There's no question that that not only is the danger of the multiple perspective orientation that people lose their sense of commitment, which in a faith-based university you'd clearly be worried about and concerned, and as well you should, but that they lose their sense of identity, that they essentially become so uncertain of everything that they become a kind of lost soul. There's one of the quotes from one of the scholars that says, where he says, look, ultimately, the goal is not to see how many different meanings you can generate. The goal is to be a human being with a certain wholeness and integrity, with a capacity to experience this multiplicity. Here again, I guess I would think about intentionality. I mean, I don't think that these questions are by and large, they certainly when I was teaching, I don't think these were on my radar screen. And therefore, it was very likely that I was utterly unaware of some of those impacts. And by the way, you know, I did mainly graduate education, doctoral education, which is particularly an act of formation because very often you're with a student for 4 or 5 years. They become extended members of your family. If you don't recognize that you are engaged in a process of formation, and often reciprocal formation, because if you're a good teacher, they're impacting you as well, then you misunderstand the role entirely. So I would say a kind of consciousness and an intentionality would be terribly important. Another might be, I don't know how you do things like capstone courses here at Baylor, if you do them at all. I mean, they've been but it is, I would design capstone experiences so they're not at all disciplinary, so they really give students the challenge of integrating things that they have been learning into more personally, socially, politically meaningful, religiously meaningful dilemmas that they might imagine. I mean, for example, I gave a talk to the faculty of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem 3 weeks ago, and they're developing a new interdisciplinary undergraduate program that all undergraduates are going to have to take. I mean, general education, as I mentioned earlier, is not a norm outside of the United States. And there had been an automobile accident a few weeks earlier in which the most famous soccer star in Israel had been riding a motorcycle and was in an accident, and he was in a coma, and he was brain dead. And the question was, he had filled out a card about donating his organs, and the family was ready to accept the verdict of the physicians that this man is dead. And just before they did, 2 rabbis came to the family and said, he's not dead. The rabbinical sources say it is not the death of the brain that defines death, but in our tradition, it is the death of the heart. Now, this is 2,000-year-old text. Besides that, we are going to pray for his recovery. And as long as we can pray for him, there is always a chance for a miracle. And under those conditions, if you permit him to die, you'll be murdering him. Well, you know, so, I mean, they were trying to figure out why I was talking about this, the faculty. And I said, now, I would put this sort of thing into a capstone or a foundation stone course. Because if you're teaching about biology, what does it mean for something to be alive? What's the difference between life and death? In a personal sense, in a policy sense. Is somebody dead when their brain is dead or when the family has given up hope? Is somebody dead when nobody is willing to pray for them anymore? Is that the definition of death? And how do you work this out in policy terms? And is there a relationship between defining when death begins and when life begins? Another small issue in our society. And what about, you know, I mean, and so, I mean, these are examples of curriculum, I would contend, that it's very hard to sit back and be disinterested in, not see it as something that engages you personally. And I would say one of our responsibilities as a faculty is to look for curricular and pedagogical occasions in which we and our students together address these kinds of questions, which draw on the biology they've learned and the humanities they've learned and the law they've learned, and I mean, lots of stuff, the political science they've learned, but ultimately you're making it very personal, and that's the sort of thing I think I would intentionally try to do and think of other things like it. I think so. I think so, because it's very hard when you're, even with a hypothetical like that, to say, oh, yeah, I guess I could, well, give me about 3 weeks and I'll decide whether to pull the plug or not. You know, I mean, it's these are the kind of, so yeah, to look for these. And they're hard to teach. It means we've got to teach some stuff together that we normally teach separately. I mean, but that's what the intentionality looks like.
She's coming back there with a microphone.
Yes, sir.
Hi. With a man of your intellectual and academic background, and through all these years of learning, what would you say that you've taken from your education that you value the most?
You meant that to be an easy question, right?
Absolutely.
Do I get two answers instead of just one?
As many as you want.
Well, I think one thing, and it's humbling, is that the older I get, and I'm 72 now, and I got my PhD at 24, so I've been doing this for a long time. There are all kinds of stuff I really thought I understood when I was in my 20s that I got less and less certain about as I got older. And now that I'm in my 70s, a lot of these things I'm convinced I don't understand at all. Now, that didn't stop me from teaching about them. I mean, you know, the old joke is, you know, did you read President Starr's book? And the answer that one professor gives is, not only have I not yet read it, I haven't even taught it yet, you know. But I guess part of the answer is that I think I'm much more self-critical about the grounds on which I think I know something. But I'm actually more comfortable with that state than I was when I was much younger, because it doesn't feel unnatural. It seems, oh God, it's going to sound arrogant, but it seems wise to understand what I don't understand. And it's the sort of thing, I think, that leads to me being much more willing and eager to invite multiple opinions and views and evidence to the table where I'm sitting. Because I really think I've developed epistemic empathy and epistemic mindfulness in this sense. If you don't feel totally smart yourself, you're much more likely to be ready to learn from other people and to see their insights as having value, you know, a little extra piece. And well, you know, maybe I won't stop and go to a second. I think that's been a really, really important thing to learn. I suppose the second is, I used to think that academic footnotes were a kind of meaningless ritual. You know, if you don't have a long list of references, then they won't give you an A. You can't get published. I'm now much more conscious of the extent to which almost everything I think I know, I didn't figure out by myself. I figured a few things out, as John said, you know, I had some things that thousands of people are referencing, but yeah, it's tiny. Most of what I know because other people did their own scholarship and were generous enough to share it with me through writing articles and books and giving talks, and that I have no way of paying them. I can't give them royalties. But if I acknowledge them in things that I say are right, that's like writing them a thank you note. That's a constant reminder to me and everybody around that we're in this together. And you know, it's not an accident that one of the worst sins you can commit in the academy is plagiarism. And plagiarism is such a terrible sin because you have taken unfair, inappropriate advantage of the generosity of another Somebody gave you the use of their idea, and all they asked for, all they expected, is that you say thank you in a reference, in a footnote, and you wouldn't even do that. I think that's part of the great generosity of the scholarly life that many of us have chosen. I think that's been an important thing I've learned too.
I think actually that's a great way to stop, and we'll have some time to have conversation after this. We have a gift for you to commemorate your time at Baylor. This was made especially for you. It's a piece thrown by our ceramist in residence.
Oh my.
So this is a true Baylor treasure, and we will be sure it's kind of large and heavyish, but we will be sure to get this
To me. Okay, yes, I was going to say, thank you very much.